On the 19th of May 1999, Juan Mendez heard a scream in the canyon, and it changed everything. Juan Mendez knew every bend of the Rio Grande River in Big Bend National Park better than the lines on his own palm. He was 27 in the spring of 1999, and his 7th year as a ranger in this rugged corner of Texas had already left the first wrinkles on his face, as deep and unpredictable as the canyons he patrolled. Every morning as he put on his wide-brimmed uniform hat, Juan thought back to the day that changed his life forever. He was 12 when he sat on the banks of the Rio Grande all night, waiting for his uncle and cousins to cross the border. They never came. A week later, the Border Patrol found their bodies in the desert, off the beaten path without water, under the merciless Texas sun. Juan's parents had crossed the border legally 10 years earlier, thanks to luck and the right paperwork. His family was lucky, others were not. This simple truth became the foundation of his life. Big Bend did not forgive mistakes. The majestic park of over 1,000 square kilometers was a dangerous maze of hot deserts, sheer cliffs, and winding canyons. Temperatures soared to 49 degrees during the day and dropped below zero at night. Dangerous predators, poisonous plants, treacherous trails, deceptive mirages, and that's not counting people with bad intentions, for whom the wilderness was the perfect hiding place. The old rangers said the canyon kept some secrets for decades, but sometimes the river rises and brings them to the surface. Bones, weapons, lost things. Stories long buried beneath sand and oblivion. Juan believed his job was not just to preserve nature, but also to protect people seeking a better life from the risks of this harsh land. In the spring of 1999, Juan Mendez did not yet know that his familiar park hid dark secrets that would change his life forever, and that some of the discoveries he would make in the depths of Santa Elena Canyon would be better left buried beneath the sand of the Chihuahua Desert. What Juan Mendez found in Santa Elena Canyon on the 19th of May 1999 was no accident. He would later realize that the ancient Aztec symbol and the traces of blood in the sand were the beginning of a chain of events that risked costing the lives of many people, including himself. Juan began his patrol at 5:30 a.m., when the first rays of sunlight had just painted the eastern edge of the desert a golden color. At this time of year, the temperature was rapidly rising from a comfortable morning 18 degrees to a sizzling afternoon 40. He scheduled radio conversations with the other rangers for 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. unless there was an emergency. Juan's equipment was honed by years of experience. 4 liters of water in special thermal containers were attached to his belt and rucksack, ensuring access even when traveling on narrow trails. A GPS unit, a relatively new acquisition by the Park Service, complemented the traditional topographic map, protected in a waterproof case. Binoculars, first aid kit, spare batteries for the radio, sunscreen, compass, signal lantern, matches in a sealed pack, a knife, a light snack of dried meat and nuts. Everything had its place and purpose. The route for the day included the eastern portion of Santa Elena Canyon, one of the 3 main canyons in the park. Vertical limestone walls up to 500 meters high created an impressive corridor for the Rio Grande River, which here became the border between the USA and Mexico. Officially, Juan was checking the condition of the hiking trails and observing animals after a recent period of rain. By 7 o'clock, the sun was already blazing, and the silence was broken only by the rustling of the desert dwellers and the rare cries of hawks soaring over the canyon. Juan methodically checked the marks on the map. A herd of forked antelope grazed at a safe distance from the trail. The tracks of a desert badger crossed his route. In a rocky ravine, he spotted fresh rattlesnake tracks and made a note in his notebook to warn hiking groups. At 8:40, Juan reached a point where the trail descended to one of the few accessible shoals in the river. This spot was 4 kilometers from the nearest official crossing point. The ranger's experienced eye immediately spotted an anomaly. Fresh footprints in the sand leading to a narrow crevice in the rock where tourists did not normally enter. This part of the canyon was not marked in the guidebooks, and most park visitors were unaware of its existence. Following his hunting instinct, developed through years of work, Juan moved cautiously along the tracks. The shoe prints belonged to at least 3 different people, and one of them, judging by the depth of the tracks, was carrying something heavy, something or someone. The crevice was wider than it looked from the outside and went about 20 meters deep into the rock, forming a small grotto. Here, among the rocks, Juan found clear signs of recent human occupancy: the remains of a campfire, wrappers from energy bars with American labels, and several empty water bottles. But the most disturbing findings were the dark stains on the sand that looked like dried blood, and a scrap of cloth stuck between the rocks. As he examined the site more carefully, Juan noticed a glint of metal in the sand. When he picked it up, he was surprised to find that he was holding an Aztec cross of Quetzalcoatl, a small silver pendant with a skull in the center and snake motifs around the edges. Juan immediately recalled his mother's stories about ancient Aztec symbols and their meaning. Such crosses, she said, were worn as amulets, especially when going on dangerous journeys. Suddenly, Juan felt someone's eyes on him. The ranger's instincts kicked in instantly as he slowly lowered his hand to his holster and turned cautiously toward the exit of the grotto. The sunlight streaming through the crevice was blinding his eyes, but he was sure he saw movement at the entrance. From the depths of the canyon came a sound like a muffled human cry, or was it the cry of a bird? In the acoustically complex environment of the canyons, sounds were often distorted, deceiving even experienced rangers. Juan made the decision to check. Clutching the grip of his pistol tighter, he moved cautiously toward the exit of the grotto. At that moment, 3 figures appeared in the crevice, 2 men with automatic rifles and a third, apparently their guide, with a machete on his belt. Everyone's reaction was the same: a momentary freeze at the sight of each other. Juan introduced himself as a national park ranger. The older of the men said something quickly to the others in Spanish, too quietly for Juan to hear. Then, ignoring the demand to stop, all 3 turned and disappeared around the corner of the canyon. It was against Ranger Service security protocol to pursue armed men alone, and Juan, after a second's hesitation, chose to follow instructions. Back at the base by 4:30 p.m., Juan compiled a detailed report on the incident, including the coordinates of the grotto and a description of the suspicious persons. His immediate superior, Chief Ranger Thomas Davis, viewed the report with his usual skepticism. In response to Juan's concerns, Davis merely shrugged. Just another group of illegals using the park as a transit point. As for the blood and the strange screaming, not much happens at the border. Someone in the group must have hurt themselves while crossing. The Border Patrol has been notified, but further investigation is unlikely to follow. That evening, back in his small house on the outskirts of Terlingua, Juan took a long look at the cross he had found. His mother had told him that the Aztecs believed that such symbols protected the owner on his journey to the afterlife. The cross with the skull was especially valued because it combined the symbols of life and death, reminding him of the thin line between the two. Determined to preserve his find, Juan hid the cross in a wooden box where he kept the few family heirlooms. The next morning, the 20th of May, 1999, began with disturbing news. A ranger dispatcher reported that a young couple of hikers from Austin had not returned from a day hike in the Santa Elena Canyon area. Their SUV was found parked at the start of the hiking trail, just a kilometer from the crevasse where Juan had met the gunman. On the 15th of March 2002, the heaviest downpour in a decade hit Big Bend. The water eroded the sandy slope in Santa Elena Canyon and brought with it not only mud and rocks, but also a secret that Juan Mendez had been trying to solve for 3 long years, a secret for which people paid with their lives. Since the terrorist attacks of the 11th of September 2001, the border with Mexico has become a high-profile area. The number of border patrols doubled and document checks became more thorough. Juan never forgot about the missing tourists and the Aztecross. For 3 years he continued his quiet investigation unnoticed by his superiors. The Austin couple was never found, and search operations were curtailed 2 weeks after their disappearance. Too few resources for too much territory. The official reports read, presumed dead from dehydration after straying from the marked trail. But Juan knew that on that day, the tracks in the sand had led in a very different direction. Patrolling the canyon after a rainstorm wasn't part of his job description, but Juan volunteered to check the condition of the hiking trails before the park's scheduled reopening. The rivers and streams in Big Bend had a character all their own. They could remain parched for years and then turn into deadly torrents in a matter of hours. This downpour changed the topography of the canyon's eastern slope, collapsing an entire layer of limestone and exposing what had been hidden from human eyes for years. Half a mile from the unfortunate crevice where he had found the cross, Juan discovered a hiding place. In a small natural cave that had been washed out by a recent flood, there were rucksacks, shoes, clothes, small personal items, all the things people usually take with them on a long journey. Methodically examining each item, Juan suddenly froze. A small toy, a plush jaguar with one glass eye, had fallen out of the half-destroyed rucksack. It was exactly the same toy his cousin Ramon had had when he'd traveled across the desert with his father in 1984. A prickle rose in the ranger's throat as he picked up the worn toy, covered with sand and shells that the water had brought from the riverbank. Most of the items did not belong to Americans. The inscriptions on the items were in Spanish, and poorly preserved Mexican ID cards were found among the documents. This might have confirmed the Superior's version of mere illegals, if not for another find, an expensive camera and a drawing tablet with the initials LK, the same initials as the missing Austin tourist, Laura Klein. Juan carefully gathered all the documents and small items that could serve as evidence. They confirmed what he had suspected all along. There was a connection between the disappearance of the tourists and the groups crossing the border. Juan did not go to his superiors with his findings. Instead, he went to the small town of Mexican side of the border. There, in a dilapidated shack on the outskirts, lived his old friend Miguel Santos. A former guide for American explorers, Miguel knew these places as well as Juan and had connections on. Sitting on the old porch overlooking the distant cliffs of Big Bend, Miguel took a long look at Juan's findings. Then he told what the ranger was already beginning to suspect. There were villages of people who had entered the desert but never returned from it. At least 10 families from surrounding communities had lost relatives trying to cross the border through Santa Elena Canyon in the past 3 years. Contact with the same group of guides who promised a safe crossing. The locals called it the ghosts of the canyon. They said the desert took those who didn't respect its ancient laws. But Miguel, who had grown up in the midst of these superstitions, had long suspected that it was not a matter of curses. The guides who charged desperate people the last of their money were probably connected to the drug cartels that used the routes through the park. Who could guarantee that the migrants weren't simply eliminated so they couldn't tell about the secret trails, and the tourists? They could have been accidental witnesses. Or, Miguel pondered, they could have been taken hostage for ransom. The Americans traveling through the park were often from wealthy families. Back on the American side with the new information, Juan tried to interest his superior. Thomas Davis's reaction was predictable. "Don't make a fuss about illegals, Mendez. We have enough problems as it is. After last year's terrorist attack, the feds are digging their noses into the ground looking for terrorists at every turn. You think anyone cares about missing Mexicans?" Juan remained silent, staring at the picture of the missing American couple still hanging on the notice board in the ranger's office. They cared. Their families cared. These people deserved justice no matter which side of the border they were born on. Juan spent the next 2 months in the Terlingua archives, studying old maps and geological reports about Big Bend. In the 1930s, there were several mercury mines in the area, most of which had closed by the 1950s due to depletion and dangerous conditions for workers. Many were flooded when an artificial lake was created after a dam was built upstream of the Rio Grande. In the archives of the mining department, Juan found a map of the Esperanza mine, which officially closed in 1943. The yellowed sheet marked an unknown tunnel leading toward Santa Elena Canyon, a tunnel not mentioned in any contemporary report. According to the notes in the margin, It had been mothballed because of the instability of the rock, and the entrance had been capped, but there was a handwritten note on the map that said access possible through the northeast drift during the dry season. Looking at the map showing the tunnel, Juan felt the pieces of the puzzle begin to come together. If the entrance to the mine was near a shallow part of the river, it could indeed become accessible during a drought. A perfect place to hide. The perfect place to hide people so that no one would ever find them. As he was about to leave the archive, Juan noticed an entry in the visitor's log. Only a month ago, the same documents had been requested by one R. Cortez, a name Miguel had mentioned as one of the guides linked to the migrant disappearances. The puzzle was getting more and more sinister, but Juan knew he needed more evidence before he could act. In the meantime, he had to wait for the right moment. Perhaps the next dry season would reveal the secrets the Rio Grande had been hiding. The 2006 drought exposed more than just the hidden rocks of the Rio Grande. It also exposed the secrets Juan Mendez had been chasing for 7 years. When the river level dropped to a historic low, the ranger realized it was his last chance to stop what was happening in the Santa Elena Canyon dungeons before the river rose again and hid the truth forever. By this time, Juan had risen to chief ranger, replacing the retiring Thomas Davis. The authority of the new position gave more latitude, but also increased responsibility for other rangers and park visitors. In early May, the station received a report from a Mexican shepherd. While gathering goats on his side of the border, he discovered a metal structure protruding from a shallow stream, looking like a mine entrance with signs of recent activity. Juan immediately linked it to a map of the Esperanza mine he'd found in the archives 4 years ago. The water level had finally dropped enough to expose what had been hidden for decades beneath the flow of the Rio Grande. Realizing the gravity of the situation, he assembled a group of 4 rangers under the pretext of a geological expedition. Official cover was necessary. If suspicions were confirmed, they would be facing an organized crime group, not ordinary border crossers. On the 21st of May 2006, exactly 7 years after that unfortunate discovery, Juan's group went to the entrance. As they descended the steep slope, they saw a metal airlock, almost invisible from the outside, but clearly recently used. The hinges were not rusted through, and the sand showed signs of multiple movements. After opening the airlock, the group found themselves in front of a narrow tunnel going deep into the rock. The wall bracing system indicated that the 1930s construction had been greatly reinforced with modern materials. Moving through the tunnel by lantern light, the rangers walked about 300 meters before reaching a spacious hall that had once served as the central shaft. What they found inside exceeded Juan's darkest expectations. Along the walls stretched metal cages reminiscent of prison cells. Inside and out lay sleeping bags, leftover food, empty bottles. In the corner was a diesel generator, and nearby were handcuffs attached to rock ledges. At the far end of the cave, they found a radio station and journals, with handwritten lists of names and amounts, as well as several cassette recorders for recording messages from captives. It was obvious that people had left the place in a hurry. There was unfinished food and open water bottles on the table. Probably after news of the shepherd's discovery began to spread among the locals, one of the rangers discovered a folder of documents. It contained lists of names with amounts ranging from $5,000 to $30,000. Some names were crossed out, others were marked paid or transported. Among the papers were copies of American passports for several people, including a missing couple from Austin, and Mexican documents. In a far section of the cave, Juan came across video equipment with a camera pointed at a wood-paneled wall with a notch for a human head, a setup for recording proof of life when ransom was demanded. The radio suddenly crackled. A patrol boat was reporting suspicious movement. Several vehicles were heading toward the mine on the Mexican side. Juan ordered the group to gather all documents and return immediately. As they made their way out through the tunnel, the group heard voices approaching. Juan decided to turn down a side corridor that, according to the map, led to an exit in Santa Elena Canyon. Moving through narrow passages in places flooded with groundwater, the rangers came to an abandoned mine shaft. Climbing rusty ladders, they found themselves in the same crevice where Juan had found the Aztecross 7 years ago. The circle had closed. 3 armed men were waiting for them at the exit of the cleft. Among them, Juan recognized R. Cortez, whose name he had seen in the archive journal 4 years before. The tense confrontation lasted several minutes. Cortez offered a deal. The Rangers leave with the documents, and he and his men disappear. Otherwise, it would be known that Juan had conducted the operation without consulting the authorities. Juan realized that Cortez was bluffing for fear of kidnapping charges, but the criminal's confidence spoke volumes about his law enforcement connections. Juan declined the offer and demanded that they lay down their weapons. Cortez drew his gun. In a brief gunfight, one of his men was wounded, and the ringleader and the third raider tried to escape. The 2 Rangers stayed behind to treat the wounded man while Juan and his partner pursued the fugitives. The chase led to a hidden grotto on the riverbank. Cortez was wounded and apprehended, and his accomplice drowned while trying to swim across the Rio Grande. In the grotto, Rangers found 6 migrants, including 2 children, handcuffed together. One of the boys, frightened and exhausted, clutched in his hand an Aztec cross depicting a skull, similar to the one Juan had found 7 years earlier. As the hostages received medical attention, a grim picture finally emerged. Cortez and his gang had been using the tunnels to smuggle drugs for years. Over time, they switched to a more lucrative business, luring migrants with promises of safe border crossings, then kidnapping them for ransom or forcing them to work for the cartels. Casual witnesses, like tourists from Austin, were also victimized. Juan was faced with a choice: turn the case over to a federal agency, risking a backlash because of powerful connections, or bring justice on his own. Looking at the survivors, especially the boy with the Aztec cross, Juan made a choice. Justice should have no boundaries, just as the desert, whose guardian he had always considered himself, had no boundaries. In the spring of 2007, the level of the Rio Grande returned to normal, and the waters once again hid the entrance to the abandoned Esperanza mine. It was as if nature had erased the traces of human crime, but the memory of it lived on. The federal investigation lasted nearly 9 months. Cortez received a life sentence. 3 local officials involved in the scheme awaited trial. Thanks to the evidence Juan collected, authorities were able to identify more than 30 victims who had gone missing over the past 7 years. The names of 17 of them are forever inscribed on a stone memorial plaque at the entrance to Santa Elena Canyon. The families of a missing Austin couple finally have answers, though not the answers they hoped for. Their bodies were discovered in one of the mine's abandoned drifts during a clearing operation. Juan often visited the rescued boy with the Aztec cross. During the search for his relatives, it turned out that his parents had died trying to cross the border. In October 2007, after months of paperwork, Juan became the official guardian of 8-year-old Miguel. Ranger Mendez now conducted training sessions for new park employees, teaching them not only how to read animal tracks, but also signs of human activity in the desert. "The frontier is not a line on the ground," he said. "It's a fine line between law and lawlessness, between life and death, and it's our job to be the guardians of that boundary." One warm evening in late November, Juan and Miguel patrolled the banks of the Rio Grande on horseback as the old ranger taught the new generation to respect and understand the desert. The boy gently clutched the Aztec cross in his hand, no longer a symbol of fear, but a reminder of survival. The sun was slowly setting over the horizon, coloring the canyons of Big Bend red. To the casual observer, it was just 2 riders against a majestic landscape. But for Juan, the moment meant more than that. The circle had closed, and the story that began with loss had ended with gain. Friends, you've just heard the story of the Big Bend Ranger who uncovered the dark secrets of Santa Elena Canyon. But how many similar mines and tunnels remain undiscovered on our border? Have all the victims really been found, or are some still missing? How many more victims do the secret corners of Big Bend hide? Share your thoughts in the comments. If the story impressed you as much as it did me, Support the channel by liking and subscribing. More mysterious stories from other national parks in America are waiting for us in the next issues. See you soon.